Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, and thanks both to you and Jonathan for inviting me to contribute to the book. So I'm pleased to have put my chapter in, which, as usual with me, came at quite late in the day, but it was good to have got it in nonetheless.
You weren't the last.
Oh, that's good to know.
You
Very
did
good
a
to know.
great job, and that's what counts.
And the chapter, which hopefully you'll have a chance to read a little later in the Springer volume, really covers a period of the history of the Computer Arts Society from its refounding up until more or less the present day, and certainly covers my time as chair until 2022 when I stepped down and need to hand over to Sean at that point. But basically, it's really been the time that the Computer Arts Society made something of a comeback. And having sort of been established back in 1968, it's interesting to chart really how this society has evolved alongside the medium in which it works and the development of new technologies around us, hence the name Resurgam. And of course, and we've got Peter Narka, who's also, very much, one of the earliest and still surviving pioneers. And these three words here, computability, interactivity, connectivity, three sort of touch points, I think, of what makes computer art interesting and indeed is fundamental to its existence. And those things underpin really what the Computer Art Society has been trying to do these many years. You know me, I won't dwell on that. And this really dates back, as you can see, this is March 1969. This is from Event 1. This is a press cutting about that first exhibition at the Royal College of Art. And really sort of saying here, the concept of computer art seems to have caught on to such an extent that Event 1, organised by the BCS Computer Art Society, is to run for 2 days instead of the one originally planned.
Wow.
So, but it should not be underestimated just how new that concept was at the time and the types of art that were brought together in that place. And really, understanding the computer as a sort of medium for art at that point was very unusual. Both, I think, from the technological point of view, the BCS questioned at several points the need for a society dedicated to computer art, and equally the arts press weren't entirely supportive at that point, although there was, I think, interest in the novelty, rather like where AI art is today. There's an interest in it being novel, rather like the dog walking on two legs or talking or whatever, the novelty of it rather than perhaps wanting to understand it more fundamentally. But the thing is that the three founders of the Computer Arts Society, of whom I have one here, Alan Sutcliffe, who you may remember indeed from the times when he spoke at EVA, and very sadly missed indeed with Darko Fritz, researcher into the Yugoslavian computer arts, and the work that he's done has been very fundamental to that area too, but bringing them together in 2010. And Sutcliffe was from the side of computer music. George Mallon, of course, who I'll refer to later, is being referred to later by Catherine, and the book that we've got coming out too through Springer. George Mallon was coming from the area of cybernetics. And then finally, John Lansdowne was an architect, and one of the first, possibly the first British architect to bring computers into his practice. So these three people really sort of converged. They put out an idea at the IFIP software conference in 1968. They just posted on a physical bulletin board, as it was then, just the sort of premise of having a computer art society. And from that, very quickly, it developed into the exhibition they did in 1969. All that I think you know, or at least if you don't, you can see the histories that we've done, not least White Heat Coal Logic from MIT back in 2010. But the fruits of that sort of first piece of research, and the reason for that, of course, was the passing of John Lansdowne in 1999, which set up a project called CASH, Computer Arts, Context Histories, etc., which was run by Charlie Gear and Paul Brown at Birkbeck. That was the first project that brought me in, just newly minted PhD, and of course with Catherine as well, researching that project at Birkbeck. And the result of that, really, you can see here the gathering at the Sackler Centre. This was the first display of the collection of the Computer Arts Society, within which George Mallon was very fundamental, because his firm's System Simulation used to be based around the corner in Covent Garden, where the Apple Centre now stands, quite appropriately. But upstairs then, in the attic of that building, was kept the majority of the archives of the Computer Arts Society. And if it hadn't been for that continuity there through the foundation of system simulation and the work they did, then I think that we wouldn't have much to talk about, really. I think a lot would have been sort of cast to the winds. So we're very lucky that the paper is actually a really good way of preserving the digital, as of course Graham will always tell you. And if it hadn't been for that paper archive, I think a lot of this would have only existed really in the pages of the magazine Page, which was the journal of the Computer Arts Society, which would still be of interest, but I think without its artworks wouldn't be half so, I think, sort of impactful. And this display, it was a little hard to squint out. The whole thing was about several A1 pages put together. This is what we showed at event 2 in 2019. Just my compilation really of all the Page magazine's front covers together, just to show how the thing evolved. And you can see there's a solid block at the top from 68 to 78. And that was really perhaps the most fundamental period of the Computer Arts Society's work. And at that time, the editor of Page, or at least in the early parts from 69 through to about, I think, 73, was Gustav Metzger, the autodestructive artist, and having a fundamental interest in technology, although also being fundamentally opposed to many aspects of it, especially the military-industrial side of the technology of the time. But nonetheless, it did not stop Metzger from engaging with it, and I think that's a sort of testament to his intellectual curiosity and the breadth of his knowledge. That Metzger actually, by becoming editor, also linked the nascent Computer Arts Society, which in itself was very much a British organisation, but had links then not only into the English-speaking world, but also then into the German-speaking world and other areas as well, as far away as Japan and Brazil, where in fact early forms of computer art were also being developed. So really, through Metzger and then through other contacts, the reach of the CAS was actually quite international. I think that again has been fundamental to its ongoing development. But it does show these blocks of time where sort of different things happened around Page. You can see the design changes there about 1979. That was another period when we had Paul Brown as the editor and Dominic Borum as well. That was actually when a lot of the artists were linked with the Slade School, and the Slade's experimental unit was actually engaging with computer art in that period. Which should not be underestimated as a sort of place for innovation as well. And then, of course, with the subject of Catherine's book, The Computer in the Art Room, there were several British universities and polytechnics where computer art became very strongly developed. Leicester Polytechnic being one, of course, and Bournemouth being another. So these places really sort of started a ferment within the UK of interest in computer art. And then you'll see 2004, there's a big gap there. That's that nearly 20-year gap where the Computer Arts Society went a bit quiescent. And the curious thing is that was just as desktop computers came in. It's curious that the Computer Arts Society was very much, I think, associated with the era of mainframes, mini computers, and large research institutions. And just as the 80s begin, home computers and desktops in the workplace become established. It's a curious thing, and I think it reflects the fact that many of the pioneers went off in different directions, finding new roles in these emerging computer industries, and especially around computer graphics. Paul Brown, for instance, and the work he did in computer animation, and Tony Pritchard, of course, with the Channel 4 logo and many other things besides. So there was, we can see there's a sort of an interesting gap, and then we pick up the threads there in 2004 as the Cash project then started its work to recover what was there. And just obviously some of the people involved in the resurrection of Cash. Rather, yes.
Very, very young people.
Minus beard indeed. But I should obviously mention top left, Jeremy Gardner with the CAP project, Douglas Dodd on both the projects we had, CAP being these computer art and technicultures being the successor to Cash, taking things forward with the Victoria and Albert Museum and all the fundamental work they did in putting together the collection. So that was the sort of transference indeed of the archives from George Mallon's system simulation, plus many other artists' archives, then into the mainstream. And I think that's a very key thing for the British digital art, is that we now have that collection at the V&A, and it's a touchstone for the other collections that are being established. Paul Brown in profile at his birthday, which I think, given the fact it's in Ravensbourne, probably about 2011, I think. Do you remember, Catherine, which one it
I
was?
think he was 70.
It was the 70th,
Yeah,
I
so it's
thought.
got 7 candles, it's one
Yes.
per decade, probably.
There was something about the cake having it in binary form, but I can't read the binary from this distance, so there we are. And then, of course, Hugh Gollifer, who's also been absolutely key, I think, for the links she's brought, not only to ISEA, the Inter-Society for Electronic Arts, and the links that we've enjoyed there, but also to other artists connected with Brighton, and the lot of work being done there. Anna Dimitriou, for instance, and Alex May. So, I mean, there's been, other sort of input there too. And then gathered together in the bottom right-hand corner, we see on the far left, we've got Gustav Metzger sitting. We've got Alan Sutcliffe, and then Stroud Cornick as well, another key pioneer from Leicester, who's connected, of course, with Ernest Edmonds. So, to get them together, it's a rare thing for Gustav to even be photographed. He had a great sort of ability not to be photographed, and towards the end of his life, I was able to capture him, but earlier on, no. I should mention Tony Pritchard just on the Paul photograph from the top left. Well. And I think it's worth mentioning, as I have in the you can read the chapter for a sort of more sort of close analysis of this. But at the time when the Cash project was happening, when the Computer Art Society was refounded, there was a lot of ferment in London around digital art, and of course it was the time when net art was sort of very much making a splash. It was the early 2000s. A lot of things were coming together. Places like Silicon Roundabout, for instance, near Old Street. There was a great deal of lights have gone.
Don't worry, it comes back quickly.
Oh, that's okay.
There's one over there as well.
One of those bones where it just drops into the void and back again. Node London was a multi-party sort of project across the city, tying together lots of different institutions. We can see here at the talk at Birkbeck, we've got Richard Colston on the far right of that, and James Foray Walker in the middle, and of course our very own Charlie Gear on the left-hand side of that panel. But that just shows, one of the many events that Node organised, and I think also the Institute for Contemporary Art, the ICA, was another important sort of locus for some of the things that were happening. But London also had several pioneering galleries of digital art. And the one on the left here, the Colville Place Gallery, founded by the late Keith Watson and Wolf Lisa. Very important, I think, for a period from the late 90s when I just started my PhD through to the early 2000s when it then moved towards Hoxton and became the Deluxe Gallery. But really important, I think, that was keeping the flame of a digital art exhibition going for contemporary artists at a time when very few other venues would actually host digital art at all. It is surprising the sort of phobia that existed around the digital at the time, and I think it was rare to really get things into mainstream galleries, and certainly not for large shows. I think we forget that now, seeing some of the things that are being done. In the middle, we've got the Carol Fletcher Gallery that's founded by Jonathan Carroll and Steve Fletcher about 2007. Although it only lasted for 7 years, it was in quite a prominent place just off Oxford Street and really held, hosted a lot of interesting contemporary work. You've got Ubermorgen there being shown there, for instance. And finally, Furtherfield at its second and current location in Finsbury Park. And Furtherfield, Ruth Catlow and Mark Garrett has really been sort of at the forefront of a lot of radical developments of digital and networked art. They were looking at the blockchain way before NFTs happened, for instance. They've had their sort of ear to the ground. They've got a very good sense of what is coming. And I think that part of what I tried to do when I became the chair of CAS in 2010, was to try and plug into some of these contemporary streams. I think it was most important to actually bring those together. Mentioned very quickly the very significant Decode exhibition at the V&A in 2011. Digital Pioneers was the book that Douglas Dodds and Honor Bedard brought out as a result of the Computer Art Technocultures project. What we were doing there was, the V&A also sort of had a show of contemporary art, which was Decode, and perhaps the first really big show of digital art in London for some years, and also tie that into a display from the Computer Art Society as well. So that was also happening. There's a panel of all four of us and Francesca Franco at the far right-hand side there, with Honor Bedard in the middle between himself and still sans the beard, you see, so think it's a better look. James Hemsley at the top right, because I think very important to mention that at this stage CAS also built its links to EVA, and that having been sort of established for separate reasons, although actually with a common link through Birkbeck, because EVA goes back to the Vasari project at Birkbeck in the late 80s, where the National Gallery first scanned some works of paintings, and that Vasari project gave rise to EVA as an organisation. So EVA's had a 30-plus year history as well, but we sort of came together, and it seemed to be a really good unification that the BCS should host EVA, and that also then the sort of combined forces of CAS and EVA would work together and perhaps draw the conference more towards the digital art side, which I feel we've done so. Even more, so that's been good. There we are, just another mention of decoding the digital DNA. But the result of those streams coming together, I think, was ideas before their time. So this was the concluding conference for the CAP project, and brought together, so many people, I feel, from both the sort of what was then the history of computer arts and Alan Sutcliffe, Roman Roscoe, sadly lost to us this year, and George Mallon in one picture at the end. I'm glad I managed to snap them all in one place. But also then, also sadly lost was Bruce Wands from the SVA, Michael O'Rourke from the Pratt Institute, Professor Jo Stockham from the RCA as well. She's a special sculptor there, and also a strong supporter of contemporary computer art. But that session, the day that we had, was an absolutely packed day, and I'll just bring up some of the names for reference. But around this, I wanted to build it around Brian Refn-Smith's concept of there being a treasure trove, a hoard of art ideas that emerged in the early decades of computer art that still have not been remotely explored. We know how this happens. The next big thing comes along, and the zeitgeist has its demands. Things get left behind. So part of the role of the modern revised CAS was to find those things from the past, identify what those concepts were, bring them into the present, and as new things like NFTs and AI jump out and sort of, some people forget that there's been that sort of history and development, and we say, well, no, let's pull this back and let's see what we can draw out of the earlier decades that actually is fully relevant to what's going on now. And 2011 also was when Sean started working with CAS as well, and that built up this very important connection to the current Leicester scene and to Montfort University, and really sort of linking up the Phoenix Gallery as a space where we could exhibit. And that also then led to, I think, a sort of upswing of all the work that we were doing, both lectures and meetings in London, exhibitions and galleries, Tender Pixel, for instance, that we were connecting to organisations like the London Knowledge Lab, based at UCL. It was the Institute of Education in those days before UCL made a sort of grab for it like everything else it does. And basically, yes, all these things were, contemporary places, historical places, how we look at robotics, for instance, and also contemporary artists at the top right. And we formed relationships also with Connecticut Art Fair, which again, has, I think, largely gone now. It's quite extraordinary considering how important Connecticut was as a place. It was, I knew it certainly was in the P3 space under the University of Westminster near Baker Street, huge cavernous underground space that was perfect for showing kinetic art and really brought together so many different practitioners. And kinetic art having very much its own history, but we linked in with CAS artists, put computer art in the heart of that. And Connecticut really sort of, I think, was another venue. And then my own explorations of Full Dome, that was the Birmingham think tank in 2011. 2012 was the Alan Turing year. And in respect of this, Anna Dimitriou, Sue Gollifer and myself started to put together a Turing show. It was really looking at the connections between Turing and contemporary digital art. So we had a whole range of people in that. We had William Latham for a start. We had Paul Brown. We just see, there we go. We had Patrick Tressay with his sketching robot Paul. We also there we are. We also had Alex May in the bottom right. We got Ernest Edmonds' work in the top right of that display. And of course, Sue Golliff was showing her own works, and she's standing just in front of Roman Verosco's prints as well. So really it was an opportunity to consider the theme of AI, but in a very broad sense, what the Turing test actually meant, but also some of Turing's other concepts like morphogenesis and understanding the transformations of form that can take place with a type of cellular automata in effect. And several robots, such as My Robot Companion by Alan Dimitriou and Alex May. So that really sort of, I think, summarised and was a summation of so much of the work that we did. I've just run out of time. I will mention one more thing before I depart, because it brings the cycle neatly together, even though it's only the start of the period, really. Gustav Metzger, London Fieldworks, and this project called Gustav Metzger Thinks About Nothing. So Bruce Gilchrist from London Fieldworks and Joe Jolson, but Gilchrist in particular had been working with scans of brainwaves, looking at the shapes generated when people view certain objects in 3D, trying to understand really the different brainwaves that were being generated as people observed three-dimensional objects. And London Fieldworks had teamed up with Metzger in the sense that they were looking after him. He essentially retired to a communal space near London Fields, hence the name. And they thought perhaps he could actually, taking a cue from his autodestructive works, actually try to think about nothing. And they would record that as a shape of brainwaves. And then find a way to use that as an algorithm, as the basis for an algorithm to select shapes from the rest of their collection, their sort of catalogue of brainwaves, and turn them into a 3D object, which you see just where the pointer is there. Sort of conglomeration, it's got quite a sort of fossilised look to it. And with that in mind, they then have that object milled out of a block of Portland stone. Had to slice the stone in two halves to be able to extract the object, and then they put them back together. So what was left was actually a block of stone with a void in it, and the void was the shape of this extracted 3D object. And then that was exhibited along with the brainwaves, along with Gustav Metzger's sort of input as well. And I think that perhaps sort of summarises one of the main achievements of the second era, the second coming of CAS, was actually this project, sort of bringing together our sort of past, our historic artists with some contemporary processes and contemporary thinking around art, and then thinking what would happen next. So what happened next was Digital Revolution at the Barbican. I'll finish on that because in a way that put digital art front and centre right in the heart of London in 2014. So on that note, thank you. We can rest the story.